They say a Tudor queen always dies with drama, but not every queen died on the scaffold. 1. The very first died quietly behind decorated walls, her screams muffled by velvet curtains, her blood soaking the silks meant for celebration, and her death so private, so sudden, shattered the coldest king in England's history. Before Anne Boleyn lost her head, before Catherine Howard whispered prayers to deaf executioners, before Lady Jane Grey was betrayed by silence, there was Elizabeth of York, the queen who bled in childbirth and died in a room that smelled of wine and roses. And with her, the Tudor dream cracked for the first time. Elizabeth of York had not been born to become a Tudor queen. She was Yorkist, daughter of Edward IV, niece to Richard III, and for a time, she was England's most eligible hostage. When Henry Tudor seized the throne in the year 1485, he had one chance to make peace with the kingdom he had just ripped apart. That chance had golden hair, a York rose in her veins, and a claim that outshone his own. So he married her not in love, but in strategy, and with that wedding, the Wars of the Roses ended, at least on paper. But the marriage strangely, surprisingly, became something more than convenience. The rebel and the princess built a kingdom, and for a time, it worked. They had children, 4 of whom lived beyond infancy. Arthur, the prince everyone placed their hopes on. Henry, the spare who would become king. Margaret and Mary, daughters destined to marry into foreign thrones. And even though the ghosts of civil war still whispered through court corridors, the Tudor dynasty had roots now. Elizabeth, the once Yorkist queen, had fulfilled her duty. But in the year 1502, fate asked more of her. She fell pregnant once more. Older now, her body tired, but her spirit obedient. A new child meant new hope, but it also meant risk. She entered confinement in the Tower of London, a place that, back then, had not yet earned its reputation as a death house. It was still a royal residence, with richly decorated rooms, silken beds, and walls hung with tapestries of roses, clouds, and blooming gardens. It was in this fortress palace that Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter on the 2nd day of February in the year 1503. The baby was named Catherine, after Catherine of Aragon, the young widow of Prince Arthur and future bride of Prince Henry. But the baby didn't last. Within days, the child died, and 9 days later, Elizabeth of York followed. The cause was postpartum infection. An invisible enemy, with no mercy. Her blood turned sour. Her body, broken by too many births, stopped fighting. By the 11th day of February, she was gone, and the court fell into shock. But no one collapsed harder than the king himself. Henry VII, the man known for his iron grip on coin and crown, disappeared. He locked himself away and refused to speak. Even his closest advisors could not reach him. He dismissed his physicians. Only his mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, was allowed to tend to him. His grief was total, undignified, rough. This was not the cold architect of royal control. This was a husband who had just lost the only woman who ever softened his crown of thorns. In the days that followed, England witnessed one of the most lavish and heartbreaking funerals the country had ever seen. The Queen's body, prepared by royal embalmers, was washed with wine and rosewater, perfumed with crushed spices and wrapped in waxed cerecloth. She was dressed in her state robes, crowned in death as she had been in life. A lead effigy was made to lie atop her coffin, an image of Elizabeth in full queenly regalia, with golden rings on her fingers and a scepter in her hand. Her hair flowed down her shoulders, her eyes closed, her silence permanent. The coffin was enclosed in wood and covered in black velvet with a white damask cross. It rested first in the chapel within the Tower of London, lit by 500 tall candles, the windows draped in black. There, her sister, Catherine, Countess of Devon. It stood vigil alongside 6 noble ladies who kept watch, whispering prayers into the dark. For 3 nights, Mass was said. For 3 nights, no one slept. And then came the procession. On the 22nd day of February, her coffin was placed on a black draped carriage and drawn out of the tower. 1,000 Londoners lined the streets, 200 of the poorest citizens, dressed in mourning robes, paid for by the king himself, carried torches. Behind them came the Queen's household, then the Mayor of London, and then 8 black horses pulling the ladies of honor, including Elizabeth's 4 sisters, 37 virgins, 1 for each year of the Queen's life, stood in Cheapside, holding burning tapers. Church bells rang as the coffin passed, one after the other, like a dirge chasing the wind. When the cortege reached Westminster Abbey, her effigy was placed upon a golden hearse draped in cloth embroidered with her personal motto, humble and reverent. Heralds, bishops, nobles, ambassadors, they all gathered to say goodbye. Over 1,000 candles burned through the night, keeping death's chill at bay. Her sister held a supper in her honor. But there was no laughter, no music, only fish, prayer, and the dull sound of grief echoing down stone halls. The next morning, during the final Requiem Mass, the Bishop of Lincoln spoke the last rites. Women placed offerings at the foot of her coffin. Her chamberlain and gentlewomen broke their staves of office and cast them into the grave symbols that their service had ended. The effigy was removed. The coffin was lowered. The Queen was gone. She was buried in the Lady Chapel at Westminster, in a vault custom built for her. Later, when Henry VII died in the year 1509, he joined her, the man who had ruled with fear, who had counted coins more carefully than tears, and had spent 5 times more on her funeral than he had for his own son Arthur. In today's currency, the funeral cost more than £1.5 million. And yet, no price could resurrect the woman whose death had made the Tower of London a place of dread, because after Elizabeth of York died, that tower would never again be just a palace. It would become the waiting room for queens who would lose their lives one by one: Anne, Catherine, Jane. But only Elizabeth died a queen, and only she left behind a king who finally learned what it meant to be broken. There is a kind of silence that only visits royal rooms: thick, velvet laden, echoless, a silence too heavy for sound to rise, too sacred or too dreadful for anyone to dare break it. And it was that kind of silence that wrapped itself around Elizabeth of York in the final days of her life. It began with a whisper, a tightening in her belly, a cry from her own body that the hour had come, and in the Tower of London, then still draped in the illusion of majesty, not yet stained by executions, the Queen was led into her confinement. The doors closed behind her, and the silence began. She was not the first queen to bear a child in the Tower, but she would be the first to die for it. The year was 1503. The month February, and London was veiled in a grey coldness that dulled the clamor of the streets outside. Inside the royal apartments, The walls were softened with tapestries embroidered in roses and clouds, symbols of peace and piety, of new life and divine favor. The midwives moved in hushed efficiency. The Queen's ladies spoke only when spoken to, and in the center of the room, Elizabeth, daughter of York, Queen of England, lay beneath swathes of linen, her golden hair damp with sweat, her lips parched from pain, her voice already beginning to slip away. This was not her first birth. She had delivered many children before Arthur, Henry, Margaret. Mary and she had endured the rhythm of royal motherhood with the discipline expected of a consort. She had known the agony of losing infants, the weight of expectation, the long hours of stillness between contractions, the quickening dread when the screams did not come from the child. But this time, this final time, there was something different. The air around her felt heavier. The pain came faster. And deep within her, she must have known this would be the last thing her body gave. On the second day of February, as dusk fell early over the tower's battlements, the child was born. A girl, small, pale, quiet. She did not cry. Not at first. The silence was unbearable. Then a weak breath, a flutter of sound, and nothing more. They named her Catherine, a name already heavy with Tudor tragedy. Catherine of Aragon had been Arthur's widow and was now awaiting marriage to Prince Henry, Elizabeth's younger son. It was meant to be a gesture of continuity, of alliance, of respect. But even names could not protect the fragile. Within days, the infant died still in swaddling, not yet baptized. The Queen was not told immediately. Or perhaps she knew. Perhaps in the endless ache of her body, she could feel that the cradle in the next chamber had grown cold. 9 days passed. 9 days of bleeding, of infection, of whispered prayers and tightly clenched hands. Wine was poured, rose water soaked cloths and bedsheets alike. But nothing slowed the fever. The Queen's body, ravaged by too many births, refused to heal. Her skin turned ashen. Her lips cracked and bled. The air around her turned sour with the scent of sickness, a scent that even the finest perfumes could not mask. The court waited. The king did not speak. And then, on the 11th day of February, Elizabeth of York died. They said she passed just before dawn, while the tower was still asleep, and the city outside unaware. They said the candle at her bedside flickered once, then stilled, and they said her eyes, when closed, carried an expression of deep calm, as though the war she had been born into, married out of, and mothered beyond, had finally ended inside her. But for the man she left behind, the battle had only just begun. Henry VII had not been a king of sentiment. He had been forged in exile, tested in rebellion, crowned in victory, and ruled with careful hands. He had never wept publicly, not even when his eldest son, Arthur, died. He had always clutched power closer than emotion. But now, in the wake of Elizabeth's death, the kingdom watched a man crumble, had disappeared, vanished into his chambers, and refused to see anyone but his mother, the iron-willed Lady Margaret Beaufort. Doctors were dismissed. Food went untouched. The king, who once counted coins until his fingertips bled, now clutched nothing but silence. His closest courtiers, hardened by war and bloodshed, were stunned by the collapse of their sovereign. They had seen him furious. They had seen him shrewd. But they had never seen him broken. Word spread slowly. Bells tolled one by one. Not for announcement, but for mourning. A queen had died. The queen, the mother of the Tudor dynasty, the woman whose blood had legitimized a rebel crown, the wife who had turned strategy into stability, was gone. London held its breath. The tower went still. The room where Elizabeth died was cleared. Her linens were burned. The tapestries were taken down. No queen would ever sleep there again. And yet, despite his grief, despite his refusal to speak or smile or eat, Henry VII began to plan a funeral, the likes of which England had never seen. It would not be merely a burial. It would be a statement, a spectacle, a final proof that she had been queen in life, and would remain queen in death. Two of his most trusted men, Sir Richard Guildford and the Earl of Surrey, were tasked with preparing the ceremony. No expense was spared, not detail overlooked. Elizabeth had died in childbirth. A sacrifice, ancient and sacred. She would be remembered as a martyr of monarchy. Her body was prepared with reverence and ritual, washed in rose water, rubbed with oils and powdered spices, wrapped in wax-dipped linen strips, sealed in lead, and placed in a wooden coffin lined with black velvet. A death mask was carved, a lifelike effigy with flowing hair, a jeweled crown, and a golden scepter. It would ride atop her coffin, unblinking, majestate, silent, a queen, even in mimicry. The Tower of London, once a palace, would never again host a royal birth. From that moment on, it would become a chamber of shadows, of endings, of final footsteps. But Elizabeth was the first to die in those stone walls, the first queen whose blood would soak into the tower's stones, the first to be mourned there not with screams, but with song. Her coffin was laid in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, lit by 500 candles that burned through the night. Her sister stood beside her. Her ladies kept vigil. Prayers were whispered over her body for 3 straight days. And outside, the bells of every church in London answered the silence inside the tower with long, heavy chimes. The baby Catherine was buried quietly. No torchlight, no procession, just a small grave for a life that never cried. But Elizabeth's journey was not yet over. The coffin, when it left the tower, it would become the centerpiece of a procession, so grand it would burn itself into memory. And in that spectacle, England would say farewell not just to a queen, but to the woman who held the crown together with blood, silk, and silence. There are moments in history where the silence is louder than any scream. And in the royal bedchamber of the Tower of London, where Elizabeth of York took her final breaths, the silence had become unbearable. It clung to the walls like smoke, soaked into the velvet tapestries, and hovered above the blood-stained linen that had once been white. The curtains drawn around her bed were crimson not by design, but by consequence. By the time the Queen's body had gone still, the air no longer carried the scent of wine or rosewater, but something thicker, something metallic and irreversible. The basin beside the bed had long since overflowed, not with water, but with the cost of being queen. No one spoke of the exact moment when the bleeding had become fatal. It is easier, perhaps, to write history in clean strokes. Elizabeth died on the 11th of February, 1503, of childbed fever, but there was nothing clean about it. Not the blood on the floorboards, not the linen scorched with hot irons in a futile attempt to kill the infection, not the rags, soaked through again and again, until the midwives had to burn them. Even the fire in the hearth had grown weak, its warmth eaten away by dread and exhaustion. And though no poet recorded it, those who were there would remember the sheets, had to be changed more than 6 times in one night. Not out of modesty, but because the queen was dissolving, slowly, in front of their eyes. The infant had died already. That news had reached the corridors of court with barely a ripple. A baby girl, born into silence, buried in it. No christening, no procession, no mourning clothes. Just a name, Catherine, written into the chapel register and then forgotten. But the mother, the queen, could not be unnoticed. And as her final hours dwindled into minutes, the tower transformed from royal residence into sacred tomb. Outside, the city of London still stirred. The bells had not yet begun. But inside, in that cursed room of red, a nation was losing its queen in fragments, one drop of blood, one failed prayer, one ragged breath at a time. Henry VII had not visited her bedside. Whether out of superstition or self-preservation, he had stayed away, pacing another chamber, wringing his hands until the skin split at the knuckles. He was not a man given to passion, but now, alone in his robes of state, he pressed his face into the sleeve of his doublet and waited for someone to bring him the truth he already knew. It came with no ceremony. A knock, a bowed head, and the words, "Your Grace, she is gone." There was no scream, no falling to his knees. But something shifted inside him that day, a hinge breaking, a wall collapsing, and from that moment on, he would never again be whole. They said he locked himself in his room for days, speaking to no one but his mother, Margaret Beaufort. They said food sat untouched at his door, that even his most trusted advisors were turned away, that the curtains were drawn and the fire allowed to die out. But behind those closed doors, the king wept, not for the sake of duty, or appearance, or legacy, but because the one person who had made the weight of the crown bearable was gone, and the tower, once the backdrop to their shared rule, had betrayed them. The room where Elizabeth died was stripped the very next morning. The maids worked without speaking. Her bloodied nightgown was burned. The linens soaked in death were buried or destroyed. Even the hangings, the beautiful tapestries of roses and clouds, were taken down. Scorched at the edges by candle, smoke, and sorrow, no queen would ever sleep there again. From that day forward, the chamber would remain cold, locked, its windows sealed against the sky. The tower would no longer be called a palace. From this moment onward, it was a place of death. But the queen could not simply vanish. Her death required spectacle. Her body, still warm with the echoes of suffering, was washed in wine and rosewater. Then, dressed in her finest robes, the same she had worn on Coronation Day, though they no longer fit her wasted frame, the sergeant of the chandlery was summoned. Spices were ordered in bulk: myrrh, frankincense, clove, sweet cinnamon bark. Wax was melted and poured over strips of cerecloth, which were then wrapped tightly around her limbs. Her fingers were ringed in gold, her wrists crossed like a saint. The room filled with the thick scent of death masked in luxury. A lead coffin was made, with her name etched into the top. It was encased in Hollywood, lined with black velvet, and topped with a death effigy, so lifelike it stole the breath of anyone who dared look too closely. The effigy was dressed in her state robes, crowned, scepter in hand, hair flowing to the shoulders. She appeared as if asleep, perfect, intouchable, eternal, a queen embalmed in myth, even as the real woman lay beneath. Broken by childbirth and silence, the coffin remained in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, surrounded by 500 candles. Her sister, Catherine, Countess of Devon, kept vigil, seated by her side in mourning robes. 6 noble ladies rotated in shifts, whispering the Lord's Prayer under their breath, afraid that if they stopped, the darkness would swallow the Queen completely. Mass was said for 3 days straight. The windows were draped in black. No sunlight touched her coffin. But outside, London was stirring. The funeral was being planned, not as an act of grief, but of royal messaging. Henry would spend more on Elizabeth's death than he had on his son's. Because her passing was not just a loss, it was a warning. The Tudor dynasty was fragile. Its matriarch was dead, and England needed to remember, so the city was painted in black. Parish churches draped their doorways in velvet. Guilds handed out mourning clothes. The mayor ordered the streets cleaned for the procession. 200 poor citizens, dressed in black cloth, were paid to carry torches. 37 virgins, one for every year of Elizabeth's life, were chosen to walk in Cheapside, holding burning tapers, crowned in wreaths of white linen. It was not mourning. It was theater. Sacred, orchestrated theater. But inside the tower, where the curtains still smelled faintly of blood, none of that mattered, because the water in the basin was still red, and the Queen's room had gone cold, and no matter how many candles were lit, no matter how many nobles wept along the procession route, nothing could cleanse the stain that had begun to spread not just in the wood or in the stone, but in the soul of a kingdom that was learning, far too early, that crowns come at a price. A queen had died in childbirth, but not just any queen. The queen, the one who had ended a civil war with her marriage, the one who had united Lancaster and York in her womb, the one who had made the rebel king human. And now, that king would never again laugh in public, never again lavish coin on jewels or feast. His treasury would fill with gold, but his heart would echo with loss. The tower had taken her, and it would not be satisfied. The bells did not ring all at once. They began one by one, scattered across the city like raindrops before a storm. Small sounds that bled into the morning air, pulled from the throats of iron and rope. First came the bell at St. Peter ad Vincula inside the tower. Low and deliberate, calling not for mass, but for mourning. Then the bell of St. Paul's, echoing over the rooftops like a breath held too long. And then another, and another, and another, until all of London was trembling with the sound of grief too heavy to carry in silence. It was the 12th day of February in the year 1503, and the city had begun to cry. Inside the walls of the tower, the Queen of England no longer drew breath, but her presence had not vanished. Her coffin, now sealed in lead and velvet, remained beneath candlelight. The air still smelled of spice and wax, and the heat of too many burning tapers had turned the chamber thick and stifling. Her ladies remained close, eyes hollow, their hands locked in the quiet movements of ritual. At the altar, a priest whispered prayers for the soul of a woman who had died, delivering a child that had not lived long enough to be baptized. The silence in that room was not peace. It was weight. It was dread. It was the knowledge that the tower once thought a palace had taken its first queen, and the king had not eaten. For 3 days, Henry VII had remained cloistered behind a bolted door, away from court, away from council, away from the business of kingship. He had not spoken since the hour they told him the queen was gone. He had not bathed. He had not changed his clothes. Food brought by his servants sat untouched on silver trays outside his chamber, left to cool and rot and be taken away in shame. And still the bells rang. Not for the people of London. Not for the courtiers who wandered the halls with downcast eyes. They rang for the man who had turned his back on the world. Not out of defiance, but because he no longer had the strength to face it. The Queen was dead, and with her, something in the king had been carved out. Margaret Beaufort, his mother, his mentor, the steel spine of his reign, was the only one he allowed to enter. She came not as Lady of the Realm, not as my lady the king's mother, but simply as a mother to her son. She found him hunched near the hearth, fire dead, the smell of smoke and sweat and grief thick in the air. She said nothing. She sat beside him. She stayed. She ordered the windows unshuttered and the bedding changed. But he refused the wine, refused the broth, refused the fruit and bread. She begged him to eat. He turned away. The man who had survived battlefields, rebellions, and assassination attempts could not survive the absence of her voice. Outside, the city wore mourning like a second skin. The mayor of London had ordered black cloth hung from every doorway. Merchants paid for mourning garb and distributed it among the poor. The Lady Mayoress arranged for 37 virgins, one for each year of the Queen's life, to stand vigil in Cheapside. They wore white linen. They carried tall tapers, and when they walked, they did so with heads bowed and lips trembling, as though they understood that they were not just walking in grief, but walking in history. Some wept openly. Some stared ahead. All of them knew that the Queen's death had not just broken a man but unbalanced a kingdom. The Council of State moved cautiously. Orders were given in hushed voices. The Lord Treasurer and Controller of the royal household were tasked with organizing the funeral, and they did so with a precision born not of protocol, but reverence. This would not be a mere burial. This would be a final procession worthy of the woman who had ended a civil war by marrying her enemy, the woman who had borne a king and buried a prince, the woman who had turned a dynasty into a story. The Tower was prepared to release her. On the morning of the 22nd day of February, at the stroke of noon, 6 lords of the realm lifted the coffin from its resting place and carried it down through the Tower's narrow passageways. It was set upon a great carriage lined in black velvet and blue cloth. Atop the coffin sat the Queen's effigy, dressed in robes of state, with a golden crown atop her pale carved brow, a scepter in her right hand, and fingers heavy with rings of power and faith. Her face was serene, but not warm. Her hair spilled over her shoulders like a curtain of gold. She looked not asleep, but beyond sleep. Untouchable. Already a ghost. 200 torchbearers walked ahead of the carriage, each one dressed in mourning, each one paid by the king who would not watch them. Behind the torches came the mayor, the aldermen, the royal household, and a long train of noblewomen clad in deepest black. The Queen's 4 sisters rode behind on horseback, each led by a man in a black gown. Behind them came the carriages of the court, silent, deliberate, slow, and above all, the bells continued to toll. As the procession moved through London, parish churches rang their bells in turn. At every church passed, the knell would sound slow, final, unbearable. Children stopped in the street. Old men removed their caps. Women crossed themselves and wept without knowing why. It was not just the Queen they were mourning. It was the strange unraveling of something they had always believed permanent: the crown, the king, the Queen, the world. Now they saw death in the middle of the day, dressed in state robes, riding silently past them. At Westminster, the Queen was received like a saint. Her coffin was lifted from the carriage, and set upon a hearse cloaked in black cloth of gold. Her motto, humble and reverent, shimmered in embroidery. Banners were placed at each corner of the coffin, York roses and Tudor portcullises, lions, rampant and golden lilies. Bishops bowed. Ambassadors stared in awe. Nobles watched as over 1,000 candles were lit to surround her in light, as if England hoped to keep her from slipping into the dark. That night, her sister Catherine held a supper of mourning in the Queen's private chambers. There was no laughter, no music, only fish and bread and wine, only silence. Heralds stood at attention. Squires remained at vigil. The effigy, once a symbol of power, now felt like a mask, too perfect to be human. The king did not attend. He had eaten by then, but only under his mother's insistence, and when he did, he ate without tasting. The morning after, the final requiem was said. The Bishop of Lincoln presided. The cloth was removed from the coffin. The women of the court came forward one by one, laying offerings at the Queen's feet, rings, tokens, whispered prayers, and then came the last rite. The Queen's chamberlain stepped forward. So did her ladies. Each took their staff of office and broke it. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the chapel. The pieces were cast into the grave. And with that, the Queen was lowered into the earth. No words from the king. No final address. Only the bells. Still ringing. Still grieving. It looked like a throne. But it carried a corpse, draped in velvet blacker than sin, rimmed in gold too bright for mourning, and crowned with a figure so lifelike it could have breathed, if only someone had dared to touch it. The coffin of Elizabeth of York did not move like death often does, slow, heavy, burdened, but instead glided as if it had been born from the same solemn majesty that had crowned her queen. And yet, beneath that velvet lay a body that had bled itself empty for a child who did not live. A mother who had become a myth within days of dying. A wife whose husband still would not speak her name aloud. The effigy atop her coffin was molded from wax, and memory perfected in ways the real woman never had the chance to be. Its face was serene, untouched by pain. Lips gently parted in an illusion of sleep. Golden hair flowing over both shoulders like rivers down a mountain of silk. She wore the robes of state. She held a scepter in her right hand, and her head bore the Tudor crown. She looked more alive than the king himself. The hands that trembled were not just the king's. They belonged to every lord who stood behind the coffin. Every knight who had sworn loyalty to the Tudor throne. Every woman who had ever envied the Queen's place beside the king, because now they saw what it meant to hold that place. Now they understood that crowns could take as much as they gave. The Queen had died in the same bedchamber where she had once laughed, once whispered secrets to her ladies, once lain in her husband's arms. And now that room had been sealed, the windows nailed shut, the air inside left to rot in silence. The tower had claimed its first queen. The kingdom had not yet learned it would not be its last. The coffin left the tower with ritual more precise than any battle plan. Its cart was lined in black velvet and blue cloth, drawn by 6 horses, caparisoned in mourning garb. Behind it rode the ladies of honor, all in black. Each horse led by a man in a gown of equal sorrow. They followed in rows, like shadows given shape. Among them were the Queen's sisters Margaret, Cecily, Anne, and Catherine, each cloaked in a grief that had no words. There were no trumpets, no fanfares, only the sound of hooves on stone, the rhythmic tap of ceremonial staffs, and the rustle of fabric as the wind moved through the city's black-clad spine. Above them, The sky was gray, not with rain, but with restraint, as if heaven itself did not dare interrupt the procession. In front walked the people, 200 of them poor, unremarkable, unknown, selected to carry torches on behalf of a queen who had once represented them more than any noble ever would. They were dressed in mourning cloth, paid for by the king himself. Some had never been this close to power before, never seen royalty, except in tapestries or coins. And now, they lit the way for it to die. Their torches flickered in the afternoon light, their hands unsteady, not from fear, but from awe. Behind them came the mayor of London, the aldermen, and representatives from the guilds, each bowing their heads as they passed familiar corners now dressed in funeral drapery. Every church they approached rang its bell as the coffin neared. Every child along the roadside was told to be still. But nothing drew more breath than the moment the coffin reached Westminster. It was not the abbey they had known. Not today. That day, the great church had become a cathedral of shadows and flame. 1,000 candles were already burning by the time the coffin crossed its threshold. The columns rose like blackened trees in a forest of mourning, their trunks shrouded in cloth so dark it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The air inside trembled with incense, with the quiet hiss of wax melting onto ancient stone, with prayers whispered not to God, but to memory. The queen was home. The hearse was already waiting, a raised structure draped in cloth of gold, lined with white damask, and adorned with her motto, humble and reverent, stitched in thread that glittered even in death. The coffin was placed beneath the choir's arch, between the high altar and the royal vault, where kings slept with their crowns and queens with their secrets. Around her stood the heralds, the bishops, the ambassadors, but they were not the focus. She was, even in death. She commanded the room. That night, her effigy did not blink, but many believed it had. Some swore they saw the candlelight flicker across its cheeks like breath. Others claimed they heard soft footsteps pacing near the coffin long after the chapel had emptied. And the women who stayed, those chosen to watch until dawn, kept their hands clutched in prayer, not just for the queen, but for themselves. Because if death could come for a woman so serene, so regal, so seemingly untouchable, then what chance did any of them have? Her sister Catherine presided over a supper that evening, held in the queen's private chambers, where her perfume still lingered in the stone. There was no meat, only fish, as custom demanded, and no wine strong enough to dull the taste of sorrow. The men remained standing throughout, squires at attention, heralds, reading aloud the names of every title the queen had held: Queen, Consort of England, Lady of Ireland, Princess of York, Mother of the Future. The last one stung, because the future no longer had a mother. Henry did not come. He remained in his chamber. He had finally eaten a few days before, but only because his mother insisted. He did not dine. He did not drink. He did not speak. He had, it seemed, given his voice to grief, and it would not give it back. On the morning of the final mass, the bells rang again, but now they rang slower, more deliberate. Like the ticking of a clock no one could stop. The Bishop of Lincoln rose to speak. He did not speak of the Queen's beauty, or her laughter, or even her lineage. He spoke of her sacrifice, of the mother who had died so that the crown might endure, of the woman who had never lifted a sword, but ended a war with her wedding vows, of the silence that followed her into death. And then he stepped back, and the women of the court approached. One by one, they laid offerings at the foot of her coffin. A ring, a brook, a lock of hair, a rosary. One even laid a note, folded and bound in ribbon, the writing smeared with tears before it touched the velvet. Then came the moment no one could speak through. The breaking of the staves, the Queen's chamberlain, her master of the robes. Her household ladies each stepped forward and snapped their staff of office in two, the sound like bones breaking in a crypt. The pieces were cast into the grave. And at last, she was lowered. The effigy was lifted from the coffin and taken away. The lid was sealed. The ropes descended. The stone opened. And the Queen of England slipped into the earth like a secret finally kept. Her throne now stood empty, but her coffin, her final throne, was carried with trembling hands. And those hands would never forget the weight. There are funerals that slip into memory like shadows at dusk quiet. Personal. Quickly forgotten. And then there are the fires. The ones that burn so brightly, they leave outlines scorched on the walls of history. The ones that make even silence tremble. Elizabeth of York did not leave the world quietly. She left it in flame. In wax. In light. Her body had turned cold days ago. But her coffin burned in gold and candlelight. A spectacle meant not to console grief, but to conquer it. And around her, 1,000 flames danced, not in defiance of death, but as tribute to the woman who had once brought peace to a fractured kingdom, and now, even in death, brought the court to its knees. It was not just light that filled the air, it was perfume. The Queen's body, embalmed and wrapped in wax-sealed cloth, had been covered in crushed spices, clove, cinnamon, myrrh, rose petals pounded to powder and soaked in wine. The scent did not mask the truth. It made it sacred. A room that had once smelled of blood and fear now burned with ritual. The final stage of royal alchemy, turning flesh into symbol, sorrow into spectacle. Her fingers had been adorned with rings of gold, one for each promise she had kept, one for each life she had brought into the world, one perhaps for the unborn child who had followed her into the grave. As her coffin lay beneath the high altar of Westminster Abbey, those golden hands, silent now, still, clasped forever, caught the candlelight and threw it back at heaven. The vigil had not ended. Her body had been laid in state for days. And each hour had been marked, not by bells alone, but by human breath, knights and heralds standing watch in shifts. Ladies murmuring prayers. Children brought in pairs to glimpse their queen, one final time. No one who entered the chapel left untouched. Some wept. Others knelt. And some, those who still clutched the idea of invincibility, left in stunned silence, reminded that even crowns must eventually fall into the earth. That final morning was slow, purposefully so. The sun had barely crested the edge of the rooftops when the masses began. Latin drifted beneath the arches. The bishop moved as though time itself had thickened, dragging behind every motion. And outside, in the streets of London, the people waited, not for her to rise, but for her to pass. Again, because a queen is not buried only once. She is buried in processions, in rites, in relics. She is buried every time the crowd falls quiet, every time a candle is lit, every time a bell tolls. And this was the final toll. The coffin, once covered in black velvet, was now bare wood and lead. Its outer wrappings had been removed for burial, but the effigy remained, raised above it one last time, lifelike and cruel, as if the queen might yet open her eyes and scold them for the drama. Her robes had not changed, nor had her expression, But now, beneath the wax smile and the gold circlet, the court could see something else. Absence. The space she once filled had become a wound in the shape of a throne. Her body was lifted once more, not onto a cart, not into procession, but into the very heart of the abbey. The vault had been prepared, its stones pulled aside, its depth consecrated with prayers. This was not an ordinary tomb. This was the Lady Chapel, where kings and queens did not rest alone, but among angels, beneath fan-vaulted ceilings painted like heaven, where the echoes of coronations still lingered in the stones. This was where Elizabeth would sleep, not in exile, not in disgrace, but as the founder of a dynasty, her son Henry. The boy who would become Henry VIII was not yet king, but already the kingdom bent around the loss of his mother. When they placed her above the open grave, her sister stepped forward again. Catherine, Countess of Devon, had not left her side since death. She had washed the body, held the vigil, spoken no public word, but buried 100 private ones behind her eyes. Now she stood above the coffin with a handful of earth and let it fall, grain by grain, like a blessing or a curse. Behind her, the Queen's Chamberlain stepped forward, staff of office in hand, and with a crack, it split. He cast it down into the darkness. Then came her ladies, one by one. They broke their staffs, not with pride, not with anger, but with trembling hands that had once helped her dress, once braided her hair, once held her steady after childbirth. The wood fell in splinters. The grave accepted them all. Then came the bishop. A final prayer, a final whisper, and slowly, reverently, the coffin began to lower. The gold on her fingers caught the light one last time. And then darkness. The lid was shut. The stone replaced. The abbey returned to stillness. And with it, the Tudor court exhaled. But the king did not come. Henry VII had not stepped foot into the abbey since her body was brought there. He had ordered every detail, paid every coin, summoned every priest, but he had not watched. He could not. The man who had survived years in exile, who had won a crown with blood and cunning, who had rebuilt a kingdom from the ashes of civil war, had vanished. He remained in Richmond, alone, and it was said that for weeks afterward, he still did not speak her name. The court noticed. So did the ambassadors. One wrote that England had lost its compass, and the king had lost his anchor. He had grown thin, grayer, and he no longer smiled. Not even when his children played. He had food brought to his chambers, but sent it away, half-touched. He read no poetry, signed no commissions, refused to look at portraits of her. Even as the artist begged for approval, it was as though grief had carved a hollow in him. And all the gold in England could not fill it. But perhaps the most telling sign was this. The Tower of London was no longer used as a residence. From that moment forward, it became a place of shadows, a fortress, a prison. No royal child would be born there again. No queen would sleep there again, except to await death. Because the tower had taken Elizabeth of York, and it had left behind a fire no one could put out. A fire that burned in the chapel, in the court, in the heart of a king, and in the memory of a queen who, even in death, wore gold on her fingers and silence on her lips. The grave did not speak. It did not echo with the names once whispered into the queen's ear, nor offer up the final words she never had the strength to say. It lay beneath the Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey, sealed with stone and silence, hidden from view. yet pulsing through every corridor of the palace like a wound that refused to close. Elizabeth of York had been buried in gold, in wax, in roses, in reverence, but the stillness she left behind was not peace. It was absence. And absence has a voice all its own. She had been buried with ceremony, but not with completion. For as her coffin disappeared into the earth, and her effigy was quietly removed, and the world above her did not move on. It simply paused. The bells had ceased. The tapers had burned to wax pools on the floor. The veils had been lifted, but the grief remained a shadow stitched into the seams of court life. Elizabeth's voice had once been a quiet melody in the background of England's throne, never loud, never forceful, but always present. Now that it was gone, every silence felt like it belonged to her. In the first weeks after the burial, the palace moved as if underwater. Every step was slower, every word half-spoken. Dinners were taken in half-light. Music was silenced altogether. Laughter, once faint but frequent, had vanished. Even the young Prince Henry, not yet king, not yet dangerous, had grown keener. It was said he stood in the chapel one evening for nearly an hour, gazing at the spot where his mother lay, refusing to speak to the servants who waited outside. He was 11 years old. But the one who changed most was Henry VII. The king did not return to the Tower. He did not return to Westminster. He did not return to her rooms. Though her belongings were still untouched, the scent of her rose oil still lingering in drawers, her combs still resting on the vanity. A letter she had begun but never finished, still folded on her desk. He instead retreated to Richmond Palace. And there, he built walls between himself and the world. The grief had taken root in him, not as a storm but as a slow rot. His counselors noticed it first in the way he no longer asked about matters beyond finance. Foreign ambassadors noticed it in his silences. His mother noticed it in his eyes. Margaret Beaufort had always known her son to be disciplined, controlled. A man who had grown up in exile and learned to measure every word, every coin, every breath. But now, she saw something unraveling beneath that control. He spent hours alone, reading old accounts, counting expenses from years past. He no longer allowed music near him. The lute players were dismissed. The minstrels were sent away. Even the chimes in the garden were removed at his command. Noise, it seemed, only sharpened the shape of what he had lost. And still, there were words he never said. He never spoke of her death, never mentioned the child they had lost, Catherine. Buried quietly, without a procession. Never asked about the room in the Tower where Elizabeth had died, though he knew it had been closed, sealed, and left as it was. He never spoke her name in public again. But he did something else. He began to build. At first, no one noticed. Just a few craftsmen called to the palace, then architects, then letters sent to masons in York, in Oxford, in Kent, payments made in quiet, in gold, in enormous sums. What he was building was not a castle, not a fortress, not a church. He was building her tomb, not the resting place where she currently lay, but something new, something meant to endure. The Lady Chapel at Westminster would be expanded, reimagined, turned into something so grand that no one would dare forget who lay beneath its stones. He ordered it personally, approved every carving, every Latin inscription, and when the designs were complete, he added one final detail, a space for himself, beside her. This would not be a shrine to monarchy. It would be a monument to memory, to mourning, to a love never spoken aloud, but engraved now in marble and shadow. It was during this time that the king began to write again. Not letters, not decrees, but notes small, short, the half-finished thoughts, written in his private hand, found tucked between pages of accounts, slipped beneath ledgers, folded and forgotten. No one knows whether they were meant for her or for himself, but they contained fragments of something soft. She did not fear the night. The rose outlived the garden. I should have spoken. I am not king, where you are not queen. He never published them, never shared them, but his attendants found them over time and burned most of them, as was his custom. Outside the palace, England watched its king grieve, the only way he knew how, by pulling the country tighter. Taxes increased. Spending stopped. The court grew austere. Some called it prudence, others cruelty. But those closest to him knew. The man who had once ruled with calculation now ruled with a hollow in his chest. He no longer celebrated Christmas. He no longer hosted banquets. He no longer held tournaments. It was as if the color had bled from the realm, just as it had bled from the queen. And still, the grave waited. It would not be until 6 years later, in the year 1509, that the king would finally join her. His health declined, slowly. Then quickly. He refused medicine at first, then accepted it, then asked for his mother, then asked for God. And then when it was time, he asked to be buried beside Elizabeth, on his orders. Her body was moved to the new tomb, the one he had designed in silence, funded in sorrow, and completed just before his death. Together, at last, they lay beneath the floor of the chapel that bore their names. Not king and queen, but man and woman, husband and wife. 2 lives carved into history, but remembered best by the quiet between their names. The grave had waited, and now it had them both. But the words that were never said, they remain. In the folds of time, in the dust between stones, in the sound of bells that have long since stopped ringing. Because some stories are not told with speeches. Some are told in silence, in what is not written, in what is not spoken. Elizabeth of York never screamed. She never pleaded. She never wrote a final letter. She died as she had lived in silence, in service, in shadow, and in that silence, she left behind a kingdom that would never be the same. There is a kind of silence that lingers only in places where music once lived. In the chambers where Elizabeth once hummed lullabies. In the great halls, where court musicians once strummed their strings under candlelight. In the gardens, where children once chased shadows to the rhythm of springtime, birdsong now. There was only stillness. After her death, England did not fall into chaos. It did not erupt in rebellion. It did not burn, but it stopped singing. The song that had once come not from the pipes or the harpsichords, but from something quieter, laughter at supper, breath between kisses, whispers before sleep had vanished. And in its place came a cold that no hearth could melt. The tomb was finished before the king died. Though he never once walked its marble path, he had seen the drawings, traced them with fingers that once held her hand, approved the final sketches, with eyes that no longer sought beauty but finality. It would be in the Lady Chapel, the heart of Westminster Abbey, and it would be unlike any resting place England had ever seen. No mere grave, no hidden vault, no slab of stone tucked beneath the altar. This tomb would rise, white and eternal, a monument carved for 2 side by side, yet unreachable to each other now. His name, Henry, Hers, Elizabeth. Their effigies in gilded bronze, their hands clasped in prayer, their crowns unshaken, their mouths closed forever, together in stone. Though in life, so often apart, but here, finally, equal. The masons worked in silence. The artisans wore gloves to smooth the gold leaf. The sculptors argued in whispers about the curve of her brow, the fall of her veil, the shape of her fingers. They had never truly seen her. Few had, but all remembered her. And memory, when grief is fresh, turns sharper than portraiture. So they carved her not as she had died, but as she had once walked tall, poised, with a face too serene to be entirely mortal. They gave her no expression, as was the custom. But somehow, the finished face seemed to carry something between endurance and sorrow. The tomb was draped for months, hidden behind curtains while the king still lived. When he died, it was unveiled at last, and when the court entered the chapel to see the final resting place of the first Tudor king and his queen, they did not weep. They stood very still. They looked, and they remembered, for they had watched her die. They had watched the king wither, and now they watched the two of them lie in eternal sleep, beneath Latin inscriptions that translated only to fate. It was not just a tomb. It was a confession that peace comes at a cost, that silence is not always serenity, that the founding of a dynasty may begin not with triumph, but with loss. And as England stood on the edge of change, the Tudor court never quite sang again. Henry VIII, once the golden child, would become the most famous of their children. But long before he broke with Rome, long before Anne Boleyn, long before Catherine Howard, long before the axe and the gallows and the rotting palaces, there was a silence inside him that had begun the day his mother died. He never spoke of it, not as boy, not as king, but those who knew him in youth said there was always a pause in him, a hesitation when passing Westminster, a stillness when the name Elizabeth was spoken, a strange impatience with musicians who played too softly or women who laughed too loudly. And when he married his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, the same Catherine whom his mother had once honored by naming her doomed final daughter after he did not invite music to their wedding, there were no songs, only bells. And later, when he sent Catherine away, he did not visit the tomb again, because the tomb was never truly just for the dead. It was a mirror. It showed a kingdom what it was born from a woman's blood, a man's silence, a child who never cried, a line of monarchs birthed not in glory, but in grief. After Elizabeth, queens would fall like birds in a storm. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey. But she, Elizabeth, was the first to die in the Tower, and though she was not executed, though no blade touched her neck, her death left behind a wound in the heart of the realm that never healed. For in dying as a mother, in vanishing without scandal or treason, she became something even more dangerous to forget. She became the origin of it all. And so England stopped singing. There were still court musicians. Yes, still madrigals and processions and May Day dances. But the heart had been hollowed out, and those who had known her, one by one, disappeared. Her ladies married or were sent away. Her letters were burned or sealed. Her name was stitched into prayer books, but rarely spoken in the great halls. Even her children, Mary, Margaret, Henry, grew up in the shadow of her absence, too young to remember her smile, old enough to feel the cold she left behind. Only the tomb remained. Visitors came to Westminster Abbey and looked upon it with awe. Foreign envoys knelt before it, offering diplomatic platitudes. Commoners passed it on feast days, and lit candles in her name. But no one truly knew what lay beneath. Not just the queen who died, but the kingdom she took with her. The bells that rang the day she was buried had long stopped tolling. The streets that once trembled beneath her funeral procession now echoed with the hooves of kings who barely remembered her name. And yet the tomb stayed. Still, beautiful, stern, a warning more than a memory. For the Tudor rose had bloomed in blood, and blood, in turn, had demanded its price. And now, beneath marble and dust, beneath crowns and carved Latin prayers, beneath candles that flickered only on state occasions, the woman who once held England's future in her hands slept beside the man who had once tried to rule the world with silence. Elizabeth, Henry, the mother and the father of a dynasty. The tomb bore both their names, but only one had paid the full cost. Close your eyes. Now, let the noise fall away. Let the bells go silent. The trumpets sleep in their velvet-lined chests. Let the torches flicker into smoke. Strip the throne of its gold. Unfasten the armor. Send the courtiers home. In this moment, this final breath of the story, we return not to a coronation, not to a war, not even to a birth. We return to a single chamber. Behind stone walls that remember everything, a chamber once hung with roses and clouds, a chamber that smelled of myrrh and milk, a chamber where a woman young, and yet already exhausted by crowns, once closed her eyes and never opened them again. Elizabeth of York, the first Tudor queen, the first to fall. She did not fall by sword or scaffold. There was no trial, no charge of treason, no crowd watching with held breath. Her fall was quieter, slower, more ancient. It came in blood and heat and silence, in the way women had died for centuries. In beds, meant to hold life, not end it. She died giving England a daughter who did not survive the week. And yet her death changed the kingdom more than any act of war ever could. Because everything that came after every execution, every betrayal, every royal vow and broken marriage and whispered prayer in the tower happened in the echo of her final breath. She was not remembered with scandal. No songs were written about her downfall. No poets cast her as martyr or monster. She left no diary, no final confession. She left, instead, something heavier, the quiet. After Elizabeth died, England's pulse slowed. It did not collapse. It endured. But like a man who has learned how close the edge truly is, it moved more carefully. The royal court dimmed its feasts. The king tightened his grip on the treasury. The Tower of London, once used as a royal residence, became a prison again. Never to host another queen without also holding her fear. There are stories that scream, and there are stories that whisper. This is a whisper, a slow one. The kind you hear only if you're still enough. The kind that doesn't ask for attention but plants itself inside your ribs anyway, where it stays. They say kings die with swords in their hands, but the King Elizabeth left behind the cold, calculating. Formidable Henry VII died with her name locked in his throat. He had no mistresses after her, no remarriage, no new heirs. Only the tomb he designed in silence, the chapel he paid for in grief, and the rooms he never entered again. And England followed his lead. The musicians left the court. The colors faded from the gowns. Even the laughter of children, his own children, grew softer, not because they were told to be quiet, but because they understood something had shifted. Something had left the room and was not coming back. A mother, a queen, a thread holding the kingdom together. When Elizabeth died, she did not just die as a woman. She died as a memory not yet made. Her children were still small. Her husband had not yet grown old. Her dynasty was still young. And so the stories about her were not grand, not rich in scandal or glory. They were brief, gentle, and forgotten. But the tower remembered. When Anne Boleyn died there, she died beneath the same stones Elizabeth had once labored in. When Catherine Howard was dragged, screaming down the same corridor, those walls had once echoed with the sound of Elizabeth's breath. When Lady Jane Grey waited for the axe in silent prayer, her footsteps passed the very chamber where Elizabeth's body had been washed, perfumed, and wrapped in wax. The tower remembered, even if England did not. And so we come to the end, not with a lesson, not with a judgment, but with the truth no chronicler could polish, no herald could proclaim, no sermon could quite capture, that the first Tudor queen died alone, that her death broke the only man who ever truly loved her, that her children would never speak of her the same way again, that her name would be buried beneath her crown, that her hands, once warm and alive and full of purpose, they were covered in rings of gold and placed on her chest as if she were already a statue, that her effigy outlived her smile, that her tomb bore two names, but one silence. Elizabeth of York. She gave birth to a dynasty. She died giving birth again. And in between, she stitched together the torn cloth of a nation with nothing but patience, presence, and quiet strength. No poetry was written for her, but the silence that followed her has lasted 500 years. So when you hear the wind against the stone of the tower, or when the bells of Westminster Abbey toll for no clear reason, or when you feel a hush fall across a history book where a queen's name should be louder, know this, that silence belongs to her. Elizabeth, the first queen, the first to bleed, the first to go quietly, but not the first to be forgotten. Not anymore. Now, let the bells rest. Let the story sleep, and may she at last be heard.